Hi, Juby. It's great to get to interview you. It's been
Hi,
a long
Claire.
time. It's been a long time since I've seen you. And for
Absolutely.
those who have not seen your collection, Bound, it's a beautiful book cover. And I wanted to kind of just talk about, just the themes that you include in your book. There's a lot of
Hmm.
different themes, such as the concept of language, the concept of power, identity. It kind of feels like a continuation of your first collection, but in a different way.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So the first question I wanted to ask you, so the title Bound, it has this there's the sense of restriction and constraint, obviously, coming from the title.
Right.
Um, how do you visualize the meanings of the term bound in your collection? So like first of all, like where did the title come from? How did you come up with it? And how does it show up in your book?
I came up with the title, and I might start just for local color. I should start by saying that I did not originally want this to be the title. I was very enamored of the title of one of the poems in the book, God Responds to the Proust Questionnaire.
Mm,
But I very smartly hired an editor to help me with this book early on by the name of Lillian Yvonne Bertram, an amazing, brilliant poet. And they suggested to me that while those words were interesting together, they didn't really, for the potential reader, capture what the themes of the book were. So, what Lillian encouraged me to do was go back and think about ways in which I could find a title that sort of captured some of those various themes that you mentioned in your introduction just now that pervade the book, that are prominent throughout. And about that time, I wrote the second poem in the book, I believe. It might be the third, Mansplaining, which is one of my favorite poems in the book because it's one of the ones that makes me most vulnerable. And it didn't take long to write once I wrote it, but it took me several years to write. You mentioned my first collection, Original Kink, and I think Original Kink was setting me up to bring me to a place where I could write that poem, Mansplaining. And the second to last line in that poem begins, I so want to be bound. And
mm,
it certainly is about constriction. Um, it's about many levels of boundness. It's about being bound, as in being bound by duty, by responsibility. It's
mm,
about being bound in the kink sense,
mm.
which was something I did with my first title in my first collection, Original Kink. I wanted kink to mean many things. Bound means many things, but and I don't think I knew that when I wrote the first collection, but probably kink will always be a feature of everything, not only every poetry collection I write, but everything I write going forward. Maybe they'll change, but so far it hasn't. Over a decade, kink has persisted in being there. But it's not only being bound by or being constricted, it's being bound in a sense of belonging or togetherness. What do you
Mm.
want to cleave unto? Um, Being bound to another person, being bound to a cause, being in a space where you have a sense of belonging, where someone claims you. So, those are all the ways in which I wanted bound to resonate throughout this collection.
I love that. I mean, I especially love obviously the one about kink, but the more connected one that you talk about where it's, just kind of feeling a sort of connectiveness with all different kinds of people, places, etc.
Right,
And especially how like going back to original kink, how you
right,
bring that into conversation.
right. Absolutely.
So the concept of languages in power is something that you bring up a lot in again both I would say in both your collections. but the concept of black versus white is very prevalent in your collection. So for example, in Insurrections 3, you have the image of
Hmm.
white people in the future and renunciation. I half expect the white page I've written this on to rise up. The ending in ashes. So
Right.
how do you explore the power dynamics of language in your collection?
I I think white is a cipher. For me, I think of I use the word white throughout the collection, but I am thinking of whiteness as a cultural phenomenon, as a political phenomenon. Um, for me, whiteness is synonymous with white supremacy. It's a stand-in for capitalism and for colonialism. So these are all ways in which I feel I'm obligated to do some exploration. I was telling somebody the other day, and it was some student in a class I was asked to visit, um, what the purpose of poetry is. And I always think back to the class you and I took. I think it was with Holly Iglesias, great poet, for those of you who may not know her, and an amazing teacher also. We took a documentary poetics class, and I don't, or haven't yet at least, written a collection that is literally specifically in the mode of documentary poetics, but I always think back to Carolyn Forche and the idea of bearing witness.
Mm.
Whether or not I write strict documentary poetics, I literally think that the purpose of my poetry is to bear witness. And it's not always to bear witness to political conditions, at least not in the sense people broadly define political. But if I'm talking about love, if I'm talking about kink, I am bearing witness to oppression, often, yes. I am bearing witness to history, I hope, often, yes. For example, that's what banjo was meant to be. But I'm also trying to bear witness to joy sometimes. Like I wrote a poem in here called Black. That is meant to be mostly about joy. Um, tell me you're a poet without being a poet. Meant to be funny and silly, but also bearing witness to how one can play and be playful in the
Mm.
poetry space. So if there's an overriding sense I have of what my poetry is meant to do, it's to bear witness. So I try to find ways linguistically or in the space of language to find ciphers. Somebody somewhere along the line told me that these are cinnamon words. So maybe, words that appear and recur throughout your collection. Capitalism might be very poetic in somebody else's hands. It's not in mine. Creating stark contrasts, um, and also elements of surprise. Like you mentioned, resolution. I should mention I'm a poet who lives for a good line break. I am always trying to have a surprising, unconventional line break. Like if you see me write a poem, know whether or not you find it in the poem, that is what I hoped would happen. And if you don't find it in the poem, I might be crushed. But I'm always looking for that. So I have expect the white. I was thinking when you read that you might not expect the next word to be page. So I felt super clever in that moment. It's one of the moments, when you have those moments in your poetry where you're just like sort of smirking, you're like, I just did that. I
Oh
totally
yeah.
did that. And
Oh
people are
yeah.
going to know I did that. That was one of those moments for me. So when I talk about whiteness, it means it's very broad. And I'm always thinking of it that broadly, but it's a ciphers for so many things that are less poetic in a sense that I can't create the kinds of contrasts and disparities and imagery that I would like to in the shorthand I would like to. So that's where that comes from, I think specifically. But there are probably other ones as well. I talk about queerness a lot. So there are ways in which I might do that, but I don't think I know that I have one word to do that with. But I'm also often of the opinion that the person writing the poetry is not the best person to analyze the poetry. So there are probably things I miss that you will pick up on.
Definitely. I love that.
Yeah.
I guess going off of that, this is kind of a pretty abstract question,
Uh-oh.
because because you're talking about, different ideas that come with, the idea of whiteness, obviously,
Right.
capitalism. Specifically, I love that idea. Well, I don't love it. I don't love the idea itself. I
Right.
mean, the way that you talk about it.
Right. Right. Right.
Um, but do you see language as a tool more for liberation or more as something that serves for oppression?
Um, I think it's in not in the eye of the beholder, although it might be in the eye of the beholder, but that's not what I want to say. I think it's a tool. I think a shovel can dig a hole, and you can plant the most gorgeous flowering thing, but I think a shovel can also hit somebody over the head and kill them. So I think it's in the hands of the poet. And I think that poets of various stripes probably use it in various ways, because sometimes our goal is to liberate, but sometimes our goal is to crunch people into a space and make them feel that effect of being crunched into a space. It's not my usual goal to try to do that, although there are probably poems where I do that, if I think about it honestly. But my goal is usually toward liberation. Like that's where poems like the ones I mentioned, where I get playful, that's where those poems come from, because I think playfulness and seeking pleasure is a form of liberation. I think those are things that we, or at least certain subsets of we, are taught that we don't deserve, or that are secondary or less worthy goals in life, that we shouldn't be seeking out pleasure. We should be seeking things like meaning and responsibility and duty. But what about just straight up pleasure? Are we allowed to experience pleasure? And I feel the answer to that is yes. And so I wrote the large part of Bound during the pandemic, and I was in a space where I thought, and it was a space where we were coming up on the middle and end of the first term. Oh God, I don't even probably should say first term, but I'm terrified that I won't get the outcome I want tomorrow, at least. And there's so many ways in which no matter how I vote, I won't get the outcome I want, but that's a whole other conversation. This is about poetry, although that's about poetry too.
True.
Very true. I think that what I was looking for when I wrote this was, I was in a space where I was thinking, we have the president we have, we're in the middle of a pandemic. I have to not only survive, I have to find a way to thrive. And so I thought, I want to create something that isn't just about the trauma I've experienced. I want to create something that emanates a little joy, that shows that I'm going to be not only resilient, but experience happiness and experience joy, and be insouciant, if you will, be resolutely, unabashedly silly and giddy in the face of the shit of the world. Like I refuse to not allow myself a joke or a belly laugh, despite how terrible things are. We also need those things. So a lot of this was about that. I didn't want to lose sight of, things like the world sucks, or capitalism, like we were saying. But I also wanted very much to infuse it with, we get to play. We need to play. It is important. It is vital. It is critical to be able to play. If that makes sense.
Absolutely. That brings up a really good point, which is that infusing joy into poetry is so difficult. How do you find, so you kind of mentioned a little bit about how you found moments of joy, but how do you resist? How do you find ways in which in your poetry, in the process of your poetry, when do you come up with those moments of joy?
It's interesting. I'm not sure that I have the clearest answer to that. All of my poetry seems to be born of moments that I experience. And like Black, a poem I think that is infused with joy, was born of me watching a video on Instagram of a woman who goes around testing how Black people are. Like she interviews these white people and asks them sort of stereotypical questions that every Black person would know, like, how do you season your chicken, for example? And it's really silly and hilarious to me. But I thought, what defines Blackness in silly ways, in conventional ways, in stereotypical ways, but also in profound ways, both positive and negative. And I think the trick to writing a poem that doesn't get too nostalgic, for example, is being as true as possible, not holding the joy away from the grief, but infusing them both and trying to make people understand that they both have to be acknowledged and both deserve weight in your poem. And honestly, that's how Tell Me You're a Poet Without Telling Me You're a Poet was born too. That's a meme. That's a trend that is much bigger than poetry. Tell me you are X without telling me you're X. And I just thought, what if you applied that to poetry? What would that look like for Jubi? And so then I came up with all these really silly lines. I just thought that was joke after joke until the end. And then I was like, this just got sick. I wrote a line and I was like, oh shit, I didn't because sometimes the best part of your poetry is when you don't know how it's going to end. Like I didn't know what I was doing. I was just putting together a poem and then it took me a place. I was like, oh, I just led people here. We'll see how they react when they read the poem. They laugh and they laugh and they laugh. And then if it reads right, then they're like, oh shit, I didn't know you were going to go here. What do I do now? Where do I put this emotion you just threw at me after I was laughing and giggling? And that's often what I'm trying to do with my poetry too. Mule is meant to be sort of a commentary on capitalism, and I literally meant for it to read like a parable, like a once upon a time story. And it starts off feeling kind of funny and silly, but then it also gets a little more serious towards the end, which, there's a volta, I guess, if so to speak. And I meant it to do that too. And that's actually how mansplaining was born, because I realized that's where mansplaining fit after I wrote it. I sort of thought the man in that poem, his perspective needed to be told. I wrote Mule early in the collection. And then months later, I was like, the man hasn't had a word. The man should get a word. And then I thought, how do I write the most honest depiction of this man? Because I think that was a lot of my project in Original Kink. And I don't know I got there, because Original Kink started with me trying to write a story about my father. And then it morphed into something much broader, which was a reflection of various sorts of masculinity. But part of the reason of that is I think we don't create enough spaces where we are radically, brutally vulnerable as cisgender, at least men, about what our feelings are and how we reckon with them and wrestle with them and are unable to reconcile them. I think there are certain writers who do it, but it's few and far between. And so I just wanted to write a poem that was as relentlessly honest and painful as I could. And I called it mansplaining just to be cute, quite honest. But because, mansplaining is seen as this one thing. And I thought, but in this perspective, it's mansplaining. It's a man trying to explain himself and his perspective. So that's what it means to me there. I just realized, if I even responded to the question you asked me.
I mean, because it was such a broad question, but right. I think it kind of lays out like more of the complexities of your book in general. Right. And I did want to ask also, speaking of, I guess, like complexities. So part of your book, there was a lot of, I don't know if you would call them prose poems, because they're right. longer than that. Where did those stem from? How long did they take? And did you start out thinking you were going to write these pieces, or did they kind of come about like you were talking about, kind of surprisingly?
I had no intention of writing any of the poems in this collection very intentionally. That's not 100% true. I would get these ideas from things I read, but right after we graduated. And for viewers, for people who don't know, both Clayre and I went through the same MFA program at the University of Miami. We were in the same cohort and we graduated officially, or at least we finished the working part of our program, the class part of our program, in May of 2020. I was exhausted then. And then the pandemic hit. But before the pandemic hit, George Floyd hit. So I have heard that folks, once they finish their MFA, fall into sort of a writing black hole where they've ridden out and they're tired and they don't want to write anymore. But I fell into a hole where I didn't think I could write. So when I say I wrote this during the pandemic, I wrote this during the second half of the pandemic. Most of this was written in 2022. From May to November of 2020, I didn't write a word. What I did was I read a lot, and I listened to a lot of music. And so I got a lot of ideas. And then when I say I needed to survive and thrive, I woke up one day the week before the election and thought, I don't know how this election could turn out. I have no idea, but I have to find a way to live meaningfully, whoever is elected, because I can't go through the depression, for lack of a better word, that I've been feeling these last few months. And then I started writing. And I think the first poem I wrote for this collection may have been Mule, actually. But I didn't have ideas of how to write a collection. I didn't know it was going to be a collection. From November to about June of 2022, I just wrote lots of poems. And then that's when I went out in the world and thought, I need to show this to somebody. And so I thought I had taken a class with Lillian and Vaughn Bertram in the past, at a workshop, a virtual workshop. And actually, it was during the pandemic. It was the year before. It was in 2021, I think. And that's actually when I read the poems. I think I said 2022, but I meant 2021. But I decided later to reach out to Lillian and say, hey, I've written all these poems. Is this a thing? And Lillian came back to me and said it could be a thing, and did some amazing editing work, which, to my great joy, a couple of times were like, this is perfect. But most of the time was like, this poem starts somewhere but doesn't end somewhere. Or this poem doesn't make any sense in the context of any of these other poems, or I don't know what you're trying to do here, but it's not coming across, and gave me some very, very specific edits. And I was overjoyed that it could be a thing. And so I just spent I went to a residency at Malay Arts in June of 2022 and hunkered down. And that's where Mansplaining got written. And that's where the birth of God Responds to the Truth Questionnaire was. I was reading, because like I said, I was still, inhaling stuff. I was just reading an article from Vanity Fair, where somebody, I think it was David Bowie, responded to those questions in the Proust questionnaire, because Vanity Fair does that. And I thought, I had already known that I wanted to do a lot of work around God and what I was considering at the time kind of a takedown of God. But I try to be fair. So sure, I might take down God. I have that poem that is, that ends with the line by June Jordan, that is made up of other people's poetry lines and that is meant to be a takedown of God. But then I thought, what if God wanted to talk to us and respond to this takedown? What would God say? And I thought, God speaks in parables. God doesn't speak directly. And I thought, God's a celebrity. What if God wanted to speak through the Proust questionnaire? Because God recognized that as a way we listen. And so that's how that was born. The prose poems were a prompt from somewhere, where they suggested the vertical interrogation of strangers had in it. And you remember Maureen Seaton, amazing poem, since passed. We miss her terribly, terribly, terribly. But she had us read that book, The Vertical Interrogation of Strangers. So when I saw the prompt, I remembered the book. I remembered those meaningful questions. And I took a few of them and thought, what if I answered these from this poet's perspective? And so it wasn't built in any intentional way. And I didn't necessarily mean to write prose poems. The one poem, like when I was writing intentionally, I will say the prose poems weren't written intentionally. I mean, that one was the one that was written intentionally. But like, I had a very intention, because I promised Jericho Brown when he came to campus that someday I would write a duplex. And so that's how Eve as Snowettes was born. I was going to write a duplex, but he came to campus in 2019, and it took me 3 years to figure out what I would write a duplex about. I had always wanted to write a poetry, a sonnet sequence, and I didn't quite have the energy to write a sonnet crown or a crown of sonnets, but I wrote a sonnet sequence based on a couple I had read. And I knew when I eventually came to the decision that I was going to write it about an experience in college, and call it Eddie or Ecstasy. But it was going to be sonnets. So if it didn't work as a sonnet, I would have found something else that worked as a sonnet series, because I had wanted to write a sonnet series or sequence. And this is what I thought worked. So the moments that aren't prose poems were way more intentional for me than the poems that are. The poems that are, if I think about it, are me sort of positioning myself in a way, giving a point of view of an I that is not necessarily me. And then there are other things that I wanted to fit into a form, because I wanted to amplify the form in a certain way. You know, sonnets are about love. And I think the sonnets I wrote in this collection are the ones that mirror sonnets were about love.
Mm.
You know, Black, for example, which I've mentioned a couple of times, I needed to be tight and have a rhythm and feel a little bit jazzy because that's what it seemed to want. So that was never going to be a long line poem. It was going to be lyrics as close as it could be. Right after that comes Banjo, which I wrote as if it was going to be an encyclopedia entry, the same one that's referred to in Black, which is why it's a column of text the way it is. So formally, I was very thoughtful, except when it came to the prose poems, weirdly speaking.
Wow. So they just kind of came about, like you were just
Right.
kind of, wow, free versing it.
Yeah. The sequence that is based on Banu Capio's vertical interrogation of strangers, those were very free verse poems.
Mm.
Like I literally didn't know what I was going to write when I wrote them. But most of these poems were that. A lot of them were, at least. A couple of them were born many years before. Caribbean Gothic was a poem that actually I wrote the first half of, no, the second half of, most of the second half of in 2018. And it was not a complete poem. And a poet I was working with at the time said, "This is great, but this is not a complete poem. Where's it going?" And I literally put it down for 4 years and didn't have it. And then I realized that I needed to find a place to tell the stories my mother told me as part of this collection. I had in mind I wanted to write a poem named Caribbean Gothic for a while. So the name kind of drove the poem because it wasn't named Caribbean Gothic the first time I wrote it.
Wow.
So I wrote into the second half of the poem, and then like the last maybe 10 lines are a new ending, which is interesting how you construct poetry. There are a couple of poems that are constructed like that. They're the exceptions. But I had pieces of poems lying around, and I thought, I want this to be something slightly different than what it is, or more than what it is. So I made it that.
I love that. I mean, the fact that you had taken so long with your
Right.
poems is, I mean, I think a lot of poets do that, but I think that it's a lesson in patience
Right.
because a lot of times, especially nowadays with how easy it is to submit to things,
Right.
we kind of are looking for instant gratification. So
Right.
to actually go back and like
Right.
really, you know,
Right.
tweak things and kind of create even
Right.
new forms, it sounds like,
Right.
is really beautiful.
And I find it easy to do that partially because I have relieved something you say is interesting. Immediate gratification. I've relieved myself of, and I appreciate people who do it and I get why they think it's important, but I have relieved myself of the need of constant submission and therefore constant rejection.
Mm,
Submission takes a lot of energy, not only the work of doing it, of finding out where you should submit, and then of submitting, and money, because a lot of these submissions, maybe not most of these submissions, are not free. So it takes a lot of energy and a lot of resources to submit. And then I decided that it also takes a lot of emotional energy, 20% to be rejected, but 80% to live in that liminal space of, you know, Schrodinger's cat. I am both rejected and unrejected until the box is opened. Um,
right.
so you know, once I'm rejected, most of the time I haven't received a rejection that was crushing, that made me unable to move on with life. I
Mm,
received some that hurt more than others, but most of the time I'm just glad of the decision. And at least in a couple of weeks, I can shake that feeling of the worst of them. Usually it's 24 hours. But what I realized after because I spent most of 2018 submitting like crazy, 2017 and 2018 submitting like crazy. And then I thought, but my goal isn't even it is not important to me to be published in as many magazines as possible. And I was realizing I was getting published in places. Some of them were great, and others of them were like, I don't know this magazine that much from Campaign. Somebody suggested I submit here, but I don't know how much I care. What I want to do, I am less a singles artist. I want to create an album. I want to create a vibe. I'm taking you from A to Z. I'm very intentional. Like, these poems aren't in arbitrary order. To me, they have a flow, and to me, each poem builds on something on the poem before it. So I like to think of it like I'm Prince and I'm trying to create an album for you. These, maybe they can stand on their own, but I honestly care less about them standing on their own than I do them telling the story in the moment they need to tell it, that both builds on the story before and creates space for the next story. So I decided I was going to put all my energy into getting my books accepted. And so 2017 and 2018, I submitted. But near the end of 2018, I said, I'm not doing any more poetry, individual poetry submissions. I'm going to submit this book. And I know a lot of people have gotten 38 rejections with their books. I was lucky. I didn't have that many. I had like 14. Wow. But of the 14 rejections, 2 of them were very nice. Most of the rest were bad, but it only took me, number 15 was where the book got picked up. And people could argue that maybe because people have all sorts of thoughts about how you should publish and how important it is to win a contest, a first prize Yale series of younger poets, all those big ones. But I was pleased to be able to go with a queer press, and one that I thought had a great reputation and that had people on it that I would love to be in the company of. I didn't know at the time I was going to be one of the last books and authors that was published there. Otherwise, I might have felt a different way. But in the moment that the offer was made to me, I was over the moon. So anyway, I think I have submitted around Bound. I submitted poems to promote that Bound was coming out, which is different than spending a lot of time submitting individual poems. The year before Bound came out, I didn't do much of anything because it's just sort of an editing space you're in where you're working with the publisher, trying to decide what the book is exactly going to be, finding the cover. I only worked on that stuff. And then when we got closer, I thought about how do I publicize the book? Let's get some poems out there so I can say this is out of Bound, go read Bound. But I don't spend a lot of energy on submissions. And it's counter to what a lot of people I respect, quite honestly, say you should do. But everything doesn't work for everybody. I want to get my books out there, my albums. If somebody requests a poem, occasionally I will try to write a poem for an occasion or just because they ask me to. But otherwise, I'm like, actually now I'm not working on poetry right now. I'm working on an essay manuscript.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Exciting.
Yes, I think it is going to be called How to Be a Boy. That is the working title I am working with right now. And it was born because after Bound was done, the beginning of 2023, when I had to wait an entire year because the publication process is just long. Bound got accepted at Persia Books in like April or May of 2022. And then I had to learn, because the trajectory for Original Kink was a much faster, from when it got accepted to when it was published was literally a year. But this was 2 years, so I had a lot more time to play with. So in 2023, I was like, I'm out of school. I'm not doing any writing right now. I'm going to take a class or two. And I took a class through the Shipman Agency with a writer named Ryan Bird, really cool guy. But it was an essay class. I thought, let me do something different. And I wrote a piece for the class that was well received. And then I didn't do anything for like a month or two. And then I saw this contest called the First Pages Prize. And I thought, well, let me just submit here and see if this is a thing. The worst that can happen is they will say it's not a thing. Because the prize was $2,000. So I thought, well, that's exactly. I thought, that's pretty awesome. How often do you find a prize that big? And it was basically submit the first 5 pages or 1,200 words of your prose piece. It's either fiction or nonfiction. There are 2 contests, one on the fiction side, one on the nonfiction side, and I submit on the nonfiction side. And I should be honest, I didn't know I had a memoir in me. I didn't know what the memoir was going to be about. I just thought I have this piece I've written that I think is pretty good, that I'm going to take the first 1,200 words of and submit and see what happens. And then they said, you're a semifinalist. you're one of the 32 writers out of the hundreds or whatever that submitted that we're gonna call somebody finalist. I was like, oh great, it's something.
Wow.
And then they said, so send us a log line for what this is. And I was like, oh my God. So I had to find writers I know and say, what's a log line and how do I write one? And so I came up with whatever I thought a log line was. And then they said, okay, you're a finalist. You're down to one of the 16 that are going to win a prize. And I was like, wow, that's amazing. And
Wow.
they wanted something else. Give us your bio and something else and blah, blah, blah. And then about a month after that, I got a call from the woman who is the sponsor of these prizes and telling me I had won the prize. And I was shocked beyond all belief. But then I was like, oh, well, this prize comes with not only $2,000, but with an editor who is supposed to help you realize your dream. And I thought, well, now I have to have one, a dream. So to my credit, his name is Ian Williams. He's a Canadian author, and he's amazing as an editor as well. He's been very encouraging. He helped me shape it into less than, it's a memoir. If it's a memoir, it's a memoir and essay. So it's a collection of essays on various topics. And the only thing I can tell you is that they're around what it feels like to walk around in this body and this skin, and it being a constant site of surveillance in various ways, and me trying to break free from that, which might be what exactly my poetry is about as well. And I used to say back when we were in school, every time I try to write an essay, it turns into a poem, but for whatever reason, these are sticking as essays. So we'll see what it turns out like. I don't have a publisher or anything yet. This is just what I'm excited about working on. And I won a prize that suggested that maybe it was worth working on. So I'm going to continue working on it. And sometime this winter, I'm going to write a book proposal and then see if anybody's interested.
Wow.
But yeah, that's what I'm doing right now.
Wow. So do you think that maybe your poetry is like not like changing, but you know how your voice kind of starts to evolve?
Right. Yeah.
Maybe like your poetry doesn't want to be bound, it wants to kind of expand.
Right.
I
That may
love
be
that.
true. Yeah, I love that idea too. Thank you for that. I do very much think that. I think when I wrote Original Kink, I was very much in the space of rage. And I don't mean any
Mm.
large, like all-consuming rage. I just mean I had a lot of anger to get out about the ways I had experienced the world. And I think I didn't do this too much, but I think I towed that line that is the danger that we can tow as writers, where we talk all about our trauma and it becomes only about that.
Yeah.
That's not the wholeness of being a human. So Bound as a collection was a lot about let's break out of that. I'm going to call some people to the mat, yes, but I'm also going to much more fully express the meanness of me, which is silly, which is joyful, which is resolute, which can fight back. That's how Machete was born. Machete was born because actually right shortly after the murder of George Floyd, because I watched a video with a woman named Kimberly Jones, who is a activist in Minneapolis, and she was talking a lot about how Black folks in Minneapolis were responding to the murder of George Floyd. And you may remember there was a lot of talk in the media right then about Black folks rioting and looting. And she was kind of speaking to that. And the more she spoke in this maybe 7 to 10 minute video that I found on YouTube, she seemed to get more and more enraged, but also heartbroken at the same time. So it was like between rage and heartbreak. And there's this moment near the end of the video, maybe at the end of the video, where she says, "You're lucky what we want is justice and not revenge." And that line just stuck with me and
Mm.
stuck with me and stuck with me. And then 6 months later, the insurrection happened, and I thought, wow, you all think you have something to be enraged about.
Mm.
And that's how I wrote Machete. I was like, what if I just put myself in their shoes? What if I was them? What would I be thinking? And that's how it was born. Also, maybe as a little bit of a warning, I don't usually mean my poems to have a message in that way, but I wanted it to be clear that if people had a reason to fight, there was a reason to fight, and we're allowed to say that in our poetry too. So, yeah. But yeah, I do think my poetry is trying to grow and break. I think one of my great influences poetically, and I don't think I write like him, that was not the point, but Douglas Kearney. He is playful in poetry in a profoundly serious way, but he literally fucks with language all the time. And I hold that up as a model I aspire to, that I know I'm never going to reach, but it gives me a lot of room to be playful, because between sort of where maybe an average poet is and where he is, there's a lot of space to play with language. So I think I have all of that room to work with, and it's a lot of room. And I think my poetry does want to grow and expand. So I have been thinking about what will it look like after I finish with this group of essays and go back to mostly focusing on poetry. And maybe I won't. I can only tell you, I don't feel like I have, for example, a novel in me, or if it's a novel, it'd be a novel in verse. But I know I have more poems in me, which I didn't used to think, which once upon a time I thought, well, actually, after I wrote Original Kink, I was like, well, that's great. I'm done now. I may never read another book. And honestly, after I wrote Bound, I thought, great, I have 2. That's more than anybody can expect. I might be done. But I feel less and less like that. The more I write, the less I feel like that. So we'll see what happens.
I've heard from a lot of people, once they publish their book, especially their first book, it's kind of
Right.
like from there, you know, coming up with that next book is really like monumental.
Right.
Um, so speaking of wordplay and like fucking with language, so I before we go, I did not want to forget about this. So we were talking
Okay.
a little bit about the idea of invented language, and you say
Right.
that you come up a lot with a lot of your own words, and I was curious to know, like, is there a particular process that you use? Like, do you look up etymologies of words, or do you just kind of like, do you play with verbs, nouns?
Um, I like to verbify nouns. I want to give you credit for that, Claire, very specifically.
Oh.
Because when we were in our MFA program, you talked a lot about the etymology of words, and I didn't come in thinking about it that literally. But then I started thinking a lot about it and started looking up the etymology of words in my own poems, and, learning more about words, like the fact that hurricane is a Maya word, which I don't think I would ever have known if I hadn't sat in a class where people were like, let's etymologize words. And it's not only creating words, sometimes it's just understanding the words that you're using that exist. Like banjo is kind of a poem that was born out of the etymologizing words, and Black Before It, those were very much and then Tell Me You're a Poet Without Being a Poet has some creative words in it too. But I like to think a lot about etymologizing.
I
That
believe
sounds
so.
wrong in my mouth right
I
now.
know.
I like to think a lot about looking at the origins of words, not only to create new words, but to really have a grounding about the words I'm using.
Mm.
And understanding the multiple meanings, because where is the fun in poetry? Like with the title of this collection, playing with the multiple meanings of words within your poems as well can be fun. And so knowing the etymology and knowing that the word could have come from 1 or 2 or 5 places, or that the origin is unknown, gives you a level of playfulness and freedom that you don't always have if you don't know that etymology, or a level where you can build in something that those in the know, or who are really willing to do the research, can pick up on. That maybe on the surface the poem works whether or not you know it, but if you know it, you know more than if you didn't. I love building that into a poem, but I also like creating words a lot. But I think most of the time I'm trying to create verbs.
Mm.
Like, well, although I create nouns, like what is the name of this poem? Lower Red Riding Hood. There's a lot of like cockspume. I don't know if that's a real word or not, but it popped into my head and I literally need to use that word. And I was in love with the word. So I was very happy that I came up with it. And that poem was, if anybody had ever asked me to change it, that poem just wouldn't have been published, because I refuse. That word had to be that word, because
Absolutely.
it was what fit. So, and maybe other people will pick up on it someday if enough people rebound.
I hope
We'll
so.
see.
Yeah, absolutely.
Fingers crossed. Fingers crossed.
Well, thank you so much, Juby. This was a really amazing conversation, and I'm really glad that we got to get to chat again. It's been a long time.
It has, it has. And thank you so much for thinking of me for this. I love talking poetry, but I also love talking with you. So it's been really good to see you and to have this conversation. So let's do more of it.
Absolutely. I'd love to.